Ever wondered what happens when a boring accountant drops an $8 million secret trust fund bombshell on his smug ex and her trophy husband? I'm retired, and living proof that sometimes, the quietest lives hold the biggest surprises. Stick around, because in the next few minutes you'll see how one revelation turned a predictable life into the ultimate redemption story. Before we continue, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments section where you are listening from. My name is Victor Cole, and until yesterday, I was just a regular guy. That's what I told myself every morning as I choked down a lukewarm cup of instant coffee and scanned the obituaries. 60 lines in the local paper, and not a single name I recognized. A good start to the day. My routine was as predictable as the sunrise. Up at 6:15, a quick shower that alternated between scalding and freezing thanks to the building's ancient plumbing, then the coffee and the obits. After that, I'd pull on my standard-issue khakis and a button-down, usually blue, sometimes gray, occasionally a daring green, and head to the office. Cole Accounting, solid, reliable, and about as exciting as watching paint dry. That was our motto, though I only admitted it to myself. The office was on the third floor of a brick building downtown, above a dusty antique shop and across from a perpetually empty storefront that had once been a laundromat. I'd been crunching numbers there for 32 years, ever since I graduated with my accounting degree. 32 years. It felt like a lifetime, and yet, simultaneously, like no time at all. At 59, I was starting to feel the tick-tock of the clock more acutely. The salt in my pepper was rapidly overtaking the pepper. My hairline was staging a strategic retreat. And the reflection staring back at me from the bathroom mirror was beginning to look less like a younger, more hopeful version of myself and more like, well, like my father. Not that there was anything wrong with my father. He'd lived a good, honest life. But, exciting, wasn't a word anyone would use to describe him, and I'd always secretly hoped my life would be a little, different. Different how? I never quite knew. Perhaps filled with more adventure, more spontaneity, more of anything other than spreadsheets and tax returns. But life, as they say, has a funny way of laughing at your plans. And mine, it seemed, were destined to be as orderly and predictable as a perfectly balanced ledger. I hadn't always been this, beige. There was a time when I dreamt of traveling the world, of writing the great American novel, of maybe even learning to play the saxophone. Diane, my ex-wife, used to call me a dreamer. Now, she just called me, well, I didn't know what she called me. We hadn't spoken in years, not since the divorce. The divorce. That was a chapter in my life I preferred to keep firmly closed. It had been messy, expensive, and ultimately, a stark reminder that even the most carefully constructed plans can crumble into dust. Diane had walked away with the house, the car, and a sizable chunk of my savings. But I'd kept something back. Something she didn't know about. I'd never been particularly materialistic, but I did appreciate financial security. It was a buffer against the chaos of the world, a shield against the unexpected. And after the divorce, I needed that shield more than ever. My mother had left me a substantial trust fund when she passed away. It wasn't something I advertised. In fact, I'd kept it a secret from everyone, including Diane. It was my rainy day fund, my escape hatch, my screw you money, although I never intended to use it that way. Until yesterday. Yesterday, Diane and her new husband, Paul, cornered me at the grocery store. I was reaching for a bag of organic kale, a pathetic attempt at healthy eating, when I heard her voice. High-pitched, brittle, and instantly recognizable. Victor? Is that really you? I turned around, bracing myself. There she was, Diane, looking somehow both older and younger than I remembered. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a tight ponytail, and her face was taut with what I suspected was Botox. Beside her stood Paul, a slick, tanned man with a Rolex the size of a small car. The conversation started innocently enough. Small talk about the weather, about mutual acquaintances, about how, well, I looked. But then, inevitably, it turned to money. Paul started bragging about his latest business venture, a tech startup that was, according to him, revolutionizing the industry. Diane chimed in, her voice dripping with condescension, about their upcoming trip to the Bahamas. And then, Paul made the mistake. He glanced at my worn shoes and my slightly rumpled khakis, and he chuckled. "So, Victor," he said, his voice laced with amusement. "How's that, tiny pension treating you?" That's when something inside me snapped. 32 years of being the regular guy, of playing it safe, of keeping my secrets hidden, all came crashing down. I looked at Diane, at her smug smile, at Paul, at his condescending eyes, and I knew I couldn't take it anymore. "Actually, Paul," I said, my voice surprisingly calm. "My pension is adequate. But I also have something else." I paused for effect, letting the silence hang in the air. "I have an $8 million trust fund. 5 years gone. Half a decade. Half a decade had passed since the divorce decree became final, since Diane had punctuated our separation with a door slam and a scathing assessment of my existence. 5 years that simultaneously felt like an instant and an eternity. The echoes of their incessant, cyclical arguments still reverberated. Finances, predictably, were the root. Or rather, her perception of their inadequacy. She dreamt of Mediterranean cruises, a villa under the Tuscan sun, a life lived conspicuously, audibly. I, however, found solace in quiet evenings, the turning of pages, the comfort of routine. "Time slipping away, Victor," she'd often decry, her voice bouncing off the walls of their excessively adorned living room. "We need to live. And how can we on your accountant's salary?" That word, accountant, always spat out with a venom usually reserved for communicable diseases. I'd attempted to convey my contentment. To explain that happiness couldn't be quantified in square footage or the cost of accessories. That I derived satisfaction from my profession, enjoyed its structure. She remained deaf. Her once affectionate gaze now held a flinty edge, reflecting only her own dissatisfaction. Of course, Paul only poured fuel on the fire. Even before their union became official, he haunted the periphery, a whispering shadow promising Diane a more thrilling, more lucrative future. He possessed that salesman's charisma, that effortless self-assurance that invariably rubbed me the wrong way. The trust fund? I never breathed a word. Not initially out of malice, but complexities. My mother, a lifelong nonconformist, embraced life on her own peculiar terms. The inheritance, from a distant, scarcely remembered relation, always felt somewhat tainted, burdened by unspoken obligations. Moreover, I was reared on self-reliance. My father, a hard-working carpenter, instilled in me a profound respect for earning your daily bread. Living off unearned wealth felt, ethically skewed. As our marriage began its unraveling, the secret morphed into a defense. A bulwark, if you will. Knowing that revelation of the money would ensure I became permanently tethered, a resource to be endlessly exploited. Thus, I suppressed it, interring it deep within the labyrinthine structure of trusts and offshore accounts my mother had fabricated. And Diane, blinded by her avarice, remained blissfully unaware. Now, observing her across the restaurant, her face scarlet with a blend of anger and mortification, I experienced a flicker of something. Not quite remorse, but a close cousin. Perhaps regret that our paths had diverged so irrevocably, that finances had become such a corrosive force. But then my eyes landed on Paul, his features a mask of stunned incredulity, and that regret dissipated. He had been so self-satisfied, so patronizing, so utterly convinced of his own superiority. They both deserved this moment. The years of suppressed resentment, of feeling minimized and misconstrued, surged forth. This transcended mere finances. It was about reclaiming ownership of my narrative, about finally asserting myself. It was about demonstrating that I wasn't the inconsequential cipher they perceived. Perhaps it was a touch juvenile. But in that instant, witnessing their utter dismay, it felt undeniably, exquisitely, satisfying. Awkward dinner. The phone rang on a Tuesday, disrupting the humdrum rhythm of my afternoon. It was Diane. Her voice, once a daily comfort, now felt like nails on a chalkboard, albeit a chalkboard varnished with a thin layer of forced pleasantry. "Victor," she began, her tone almost saccharine. "Paul and I were wondering if you'd like to join us for dinner. Friday. At La Mer. La Mer. The most pretentious, overpriced seafood restaurant in the city. The kind of place Diane used to drag me to, feigning an appreciation for delicacies she couldn't pronounce, while secretly eyeing the diamond bracelets on the other patrons. "I don't know, Diane," I said, picturing my comfortable armchair and the half-finished biography of Churchill on my coffee table. I had planned a quiet evening. "Oh, come on, Victor. It'll be fun. A chance to catch up. Paul's been just dying to meet you properly." "Dying?" I echoed, skeptical. "More like sizing me up," I suspected. "Assessing the threat level, financially speaking." "All right, Diane. Friday. La Mer." Friday arrived with the inevitability of a root canal. As I pulled up to the restaurant, a gleaming monument to culinary excess, I caught sight of them through the floor-to-ceiling windows. Diane, looking unnaturally taut and shiny, and Paul. Paul was exactly as I'd pictured, a caricature of success. His hair, meticulously styled, gleamed under the chandelier light. His suit, undoubtedly Italian, probably cost more than my entire wardrobe. He had that practiced, easy smile that never quite reached his eyes, the kind of smile favored by used car salesmen and divorce lawyers. The moment I sat down, Paul launched into a monologue about his latest business venture, something involving cryptocurrency and blockchain technology that sounded vaguely illegal. He peppered his sentences with jargon I didn't understand and name-dropped CEOs I'd only read about in Forbes. "So, Victor," Paul said, finally pausing for breath, his gaze sweeping over me with thinly veiled condescension. "Diane tells me you're retired?" "Something like that," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. "Must be nice," Paul chuckled, swirling the wine in his glass. "Though I can't imagine not being actively involved, you know. Always pushing, always striving. That's what separates the winners from the, well, you know." He didn't need to finish the sentence. Diane shot him a warning glance. "Paul, really?" He ignored her. "So, what exactly did you do, Victor, before you, retired?" He made air quotes around the word retired. I took a sip of my water, stalling. "I worked for the city. Parks and Recreation." Paul's eyebrows shot up. "Parks and Recreation. My goodness. That must have been fulfilling." The word dripped with sarcasm. "I imagine the pension isn't exactly breaking the bank, though, is it?" He laughed, a loud, booming sound that echoed through the restaurant. I felt a familiar flicker of anger, the same anger I'd suppressed for years while Diane chipped away at my self-worth. But this time, it was different. This time, I had an arsenal. "No, Paul," I said, meeting his gaze. "It's not." He leaned back, a smug expression on his face. He thought he had me pegged. Another loser, clinging to the edges of Diane's new, improved life. Another stepping stone on his path to even greater glory. He was wrong. So very wrong. The tiny pension. "So, Victor," Paul began, agitating the whiskey in his glass. Embers from the hearth played across its facets, reflecting as a glint in his gaze, a predator assessing its prey. "Retirement on the horizon? What grand designs occupy your thoughts? Endless fairways, I presume? Or perhaps cultivating prize-winning roses?" Diane, at his side, flickered a brief, almost pleading look in my direction, gone too quickly to interpret. I sampled my wine, finding the Cabernet far too astringent. No firm arrangements as yet. Still, weighing my options. The stark truth was, retirement felt like approaching the edge of a cliff. One misstep, and I'd be trapped in a monotonous existence I dreaded. Paul chuckled, a deep, guttural sound. Options, indeed. How fortunate. I'm shackled to Sterling Enterprises, practically wedded to the place. Though, with Diane here, one could argue I have the best of both worlds. He gave her hand a possessive, almost staged squeeze. Leaning forward, elbows planted on the gleaming table, he continued, that pension must provide a certain cushion. Enough to ensure a comfortable existence, one would hope. The question felt invasive, a clawing for weakness. My jaw hardened. It's sufficient, I offered, keeping my answer deliberately vague. I loathed this. The condescension radiating from his every syllable, the barely veiled amusement in his eyes, grated on me. Sufficient, Paul echoed, drawing out the word with mock consideration. Well, public pensions aren't renowned for extravagance, are they? One assumes you've supplemented it with savings, then. A flush of anger threatened to engulf me. I fixed my gaze on the intricate design of the antique rug beneath the table, forcing myself to remain composed. I've managed to set aside a little, I said calmly. Paul emitted a curt, almost scornful laugh. A little. How charming, Victor. I'm certain it's more than enough to dabble. Diane tells me you always possessed a certain frugality. A commendable quality, of course, but seldom the path to substantial wealth. He was baiting me, methodically, like a cat tormenting a captured bird. The memory of Diane and myself, diligently saving for our future, surfaced. She had always craved stability, a secure life. And I had provided it, or so she believed. The pension, the savings account, that was the extent of the life she imagined we had built. She remained unaware of the trust fund my mother had established for me years ago. We all prioritize differently, Paul, I said, my voice tight. Some value things beyond mere currency. Oh, indubitably, Paul said smoothly. But let's be candid, resources simplify the acquisition of those other things significantly. Journeys, experiences, a serene twilight. All necessitate a solid fiscal bedrock. He swept his hand, indicating the opulent dining room, the unspoken message resounding, this is the power of riches. He raised his glass, scrutinizing the contents with theatrical deliberation. I intend to live to a century, at least. Outlive all my peers, revel in the fruits of my endeavors for decades hence. Hardly achievable on a paltry pension, would you agree? That did it. The floodgates opened. The calculated cruelty, the persistent belittling, the complete absence of empathy, it converged into a burning rage. My fists clenched beneath the table, nails biting into flesh. I had dedicated years to concealing my true financial standing, safeguarding my privacy, shielding myself from the parasites that wealth inevitably drew. Yet, in that instant, confronted with Paul's smug, self-assured countenance, a fierce desire to obliterate his illusion of supremacy consumed me. I longed to erase that knowing smirk and witness the shock dawn in his eyes. I inhaled deeply, struggling to regain composure. You know, Paul, I said, my voice a dangerous whisper, one might be surprised by what a paltry pension can conceal. Diane shifted uneasily, her gaze flickering between Paul and myself. She sensed the shift in the atmosphere, the palpable tension that crackled between us. She knew something was brewing. Indeed? Paul said, raising a skeptical brow. And what might that be? I smiled, a slow, deliberate smile designed to unsettle him. Perhaps, I murmured, a rather substantial secret. Mother's secret. The clinking of Diane's wine glass snapped Victor back to the present. Paul was still droning on about compound interest and aggressive investment strategies, his voice a nasal whine that grated on Victor's nerves. He stared down at his half-eaten steak, the rich aroma suddenly cloying. He needed air. He needed silence. Excuse me, he mumbled, pushing back his chair. Just need to stretch my legs. He escaped onto the patio, the cool night air a welcome balm. The manicured lawn stretched out before him, swallowed by the darkness. He leaned against the wrought iron railing, the metal cold against his palms. His mother. Everything came back to her. He hadn't thought of her in detail for a while, not really. Not beyond the vague, comforting image of a warm smile and a gentle hand. But tonight, standing in the chill of Diane's ostentatious garden, he saw her clearly. He was 25, fresh out of his accountancy course, when she'd called him to her bedside. Her voice, usually a bright melody, was a raspy whisper. The London hospital room smelled of antiseptic and lilies. "Victor, darling," she'd said, her hand, papery thin, gripping his. "There's something I need to tell you." He'd braced himself for the usual platitudes about living a good life, about finding happiness. But what she revealed was a secret, a carefully constructed fortress of wealth, built brick by brick from shrewd investments and a family history of discreet acquisitions. "A trust," she'd rasped, her breath shallow. $8 million. For you." He'd stared at her, dumbfounded. He'd known his parents were comfortable, but $8 million? It was an obscene number, a figure that belonged in a movie, not in the hands of a mild-mannered accountant. "Your father, he wanted it kept secret," she'd explained, her eyes flickering with a hint of something he couldn't quite decipher. Regret? Relief? He feared it would change things. Corrupt. And after he died, she trailed off, her gaze lost in the middle distance. He remembered the weight of the legal documents she had handed him, the dense language blurring before his eyes. The lawyer she had assigned, Mr. Abernathy, a man with eyes that held the combined wisdom and cynicism of centuries, had explained the terms. The money was untouchable until his, Victor's, 60th birthday. The income generated, however, was his to use as he saw fit. He'd used some of it, of course. Small luxuries he'd carefully disguised, fearing Diane's reaction. A better car than he needed, a tailored suit he claimed was on sale. But mostly, he'd let it accumulate, reinvesting the income, watching the numbers grow on the quarterly statements Mr. Abernathy diligently sent. He had become so used to hiding the truth. His mother's instructions echoed in his mind. "Use it wisely, Victor. Not just for yourself, but for good. And never, ever, let it change who you are." Had he failed her? Had he let the secret eat away at him, turning him into a resentful, quiet man? He had let Diane's dismissive attitude fester inside him, the knowledge of his hidden wealth a bitter pill he couldn't swallow or spit out. He looked back at the house, at the soft glow emanating from the dining room window. Paul was probably still lecturing Diane on the virtues of penny pinching and planning for the future. The irony was almost unbearable. He held a king's ransom and they treated him like a pauper. He straightened his shoulders, the cool night air invigorating him. He had a choice to make. He could continue to play the role of the meek, unassuming accountant, forever dancing to their tune. Or he could finally embrace the power his mother had entrusted to him, and rewrite his own story. A mother's warning. The humid night air clung to me like a shroud as I stood on the patio, the phantom scent of my mother's lavender perfume tickling my nose. It was a cruel trick of memory, a reminder of the woman who'd both burdened and blessed me with this secret. "Victor, darling, come closer." Her voice, raspy but firm, echoed in my mind, pulling me back to her dimly lit hospital room. The sterile smell of antiseptic had been overpowered by the vase of lilies on the bedside table, their heavy fragrance a morbid counterpoint to her failing health. I'd been 22, a nervous, gangly kid still unsure of his place in the world. She was so frail, her hand, when she gripped mine, felt like a collection of twigs. "There's something you need to know," she'd whispered, her eyes, usually bright and mischievous, now clouded with pain. "About your future." That was the day she told me about the trust, established by my grandfather, a man I'd only known through faded photographs. $8 million, untouchable until my 60th birthday. It felt obscene, a weight I wasn't sure I could bear. She saw the fear in my eyes. It's a gift, Victor, but it's also a responsibility. Your grandfather wanted to ensure his descendants were taken care of, but he also wanted them to use it wisely. I remembered the specifics now, the almost legalistic way she outlined my grandfather's wishes. A percentage to be invested conservatively, another portion earmarked for charitable donations, and the rest was mine to use as I saw fit, but with the caveat that it should be used to improve my life, not simply frittered away. Don't let it change you, Victor, she pleaded, her grip tightening on my hand. Money has a way of corrupting even the best of people. Promise me you'll stay true to yourself. Her words, etched into my memory, felt like a brand. Stay true to myself. What did that even mean after all these years of playing the dutiful son, the reliable employee, the predictable husband? Had I even known myself, or had I just been a collection of other people's expectations? Use it wisely, Victor, she continued, her voice weakening. Don't be reckless, but don't be afraid to take chances. Invest in your passions, help those in need, and for God's sake, live a little. Don't end up like your father, full of regret and what-ifs. My father. A shadow hanging over our lives, a man who'd spent his days toiling in a factory, his dreams slowly suffocated by the drudgery of routine. My mother had always warned me against following in his footsteps, against letting life pass me by. The memory faded, leaving me shivering despite the warmth of the night. The patio light seemed to mock me, casting long, distorted shadows that danced with the ghosts of my past. The dinner party chatter, muffled by the closed doors, sounded like a distant, mocking chorus. Was I living? Or merely existing? Diane's laughter, sharp and brittle, sliced through the night. It was the sound of someone who believed they had all the answers, someone who looked down on me with thinly veiled contempt. My mother's warning echoed in my ears, don't let it change you. But maybe, just maybe, a little change was exactly what I needed. Maybe it was time to finally honor her wishes, to step out of the shadows and into the light. The $8 million wasn't just money, it was a chance to rewrite my story, to finally become the man I was meant to be. The question was, did I have the courage to seize it? The boastful husband. The chime of crystal against porcelain seemed deafening against the backdrop of forced civility. Diane, ever the diplomat, gently nudged the discourse toward safer shores, the rose competition, the cratered asphalt on Elm Street, but Paul was a guided missile, laser-focused on Victor. So, Victor, Paul began, agitating the wine in his glass with theatrical slowness. The crimson liquid shimmered, throwing dancing reflections on his complacent face. Diane mentions you're on the cusp of freedom. Just a year or two left, isn't it? Victor forked a bite of Diane's bland casserole. Always his least favorite. Roughly. Enviable, Paul drawled, his tone thick with mockery. Trading balance sheets for, what awaits? Twitching binoculars. Discount buffets. Diane cast a sharp glance, but he disregarded it. He was savoring the moment. I, however, Paul continued, inflating his chest subtly, am just hitting my stride. Landed a monumental deal with those tech startups. The kind of thing that electrifies the veins, you know. Not just mind-numbing figures until, well, he let the unspoken insult linger. Victor felt the familiar prickle of inferiority. Paul had a knack for diminishing him. Deliberately. It was Paul's ritual of dominance, a reminder, particularly to Diane, of his perceived superiority. Paul's been burning the candle at both ends, Diane offered, her voice strained. He's running on fumes. Rewards for the diligent, my dear, Paul said, reaching for Diane's hand but keeping his gaze fixed on Victor. A concept perhaps lost on Victor. Existing on a humble pension, correct? Victor's jaw tightened. He knew Paul was probing, attempting to assess his finances. He wouldn't offer the satisfaction. It will suffice, he stated evenly. Paul chuckled, a low rumble that set Victor's teeth on edge. Suffice for what, exactly? Maybe a Caribbean cruise. One of those bargain packages with the saccharine cocktails. A fleeting image surfaced, a sleek yacht cutting through azure waters, a chilled glass of something exquisite in hand. The life unlived. The life deferred. He banished the vision, burying it under years of practiced detachment. I've no firm plans, Victor replied, forcing a polite smile. Then you should cultivate some, Paul countered, leaning back, eyes gleaming with predatory delight. Because let's face facts, Victor, you'll need something to occupy you. Otherwise, you'll simply be, marking time until the inevitable. Myself? I'll be out there, shaping empires, forging deals. I'll likely outlive you, old man. He erupted in laughter, a booming sound that echoed through the otherwise still room. Diane gasped softly. Paul, truly. But Paul was lost in the echo chamber of his own ego, too blinded by his arrogance to perceive the slow burn of resentment igniting within Victor. Years of being overlooked, discounted, rendered invisible, were coalescing into a white-hot fury. He glanced at Diane, her expression a study in mortification and concern. Did she genuinely see Paul's true nature, or was she still dazzled by the veneer of charm and accomplishment? Then his eyes met Paul's, still alight with smug triumph. And in that instant, Victor reached his limit. He could no longer play the part of the quiet, unassuming accountant. He needed to expose them. To make them acknowledge. The weight of the secret, the obligation of his mother's faith, felt strangely buoyant, supplanted by a steely resolve. The rules of engagement had shifted. And Victor Cole was prepared to engage. Joining the chorus. The clinking of Diane's fork against her plate was amplified in my ears, a metronome marking the seconds until I could escape. Paul, oblivious to the simmering tension, continued his monologue about a recent business deal, peppering it with condescending jabs about early retirement and finding hobbies. I stared at the swirling patterns in my water glass, trying to detach myself from the suffocating reality of this dinner. Then Diane spoke, her voice laced with a saccharine sweetness that always set my teeth on edge. Well, Victor, she said, tilting her head, at least you'll have plenty of time for those jigsaw puzzles you used to enjoy. It wasn't the words themselves, but the way she delivered them, a subtle inflection that echoed Paul's earlier derision. It felt like a carefully placed brick in the wall they were building around me, isolating me in my perceived inadequacy. I looked up, meeting her gaze. It wasn't the soft, sympathetic look she used to give me when we were married. It was different. There was a hardness there, a glint of something akin to pity, perhaps even triumph. I couldn't quite decipher it, but it stung more than any outright insult. Had she always seen me this way? As someone less than? The thought burrowed into me, a persistent, irritating tick. Paul chuckled, a booming sound that resonated through the dining room. Jigsaw puzzles? That's rich. I'll be closing deals, Victor, acquiring companies. You'll be fitting together tiny pieces of cardboard. He raised his glass. To a well-deserved, albeit uneventful, retirement. I forced a smile, the muscles in my face protesting. I picked at my salmon, the delicate flakes suddenly tasting like ash. I watched Diane take a sip of her wine, her eyes flicking to Paul, then back to me. There was a subtle approval in her expression, a silent acknowledgement of their shared perspective. It was this subtle shift in her demeanor, this quiet alignment with Paul's mockery, that truly ignited the fuse. For years, I had accepted Diane's narrative, the story of my life as a series of quiet compromises and sensible choices. I had allowed her, and others, to define me by my profession, my lack of extravagant ambition, my perceived ordinariness. But seeing her actively participate in this charade, seeing the barely concealed disdain in her eyes, something snapped. It wasn't just Paul's arrogance that fueled my rising anger, it was Diane's betrayal. Paul, I expected to be a pompous ass. But Diane, she knew me. Or at least, she used to. She knew the quiet sacrifices I had made, the stability I had provided. Now, she was joining the chorus, singing the same tune of condescension. I pushed my plate away, the clatter echoing in the sudden silence. Paul and Diane looked at me, surprise flickering across their faces. I took a deep breath, the air feeling thick and heavy in my lungs. The time for quiet acceptance was over. The meticulously constructed facade of Victor Cole, the unremarkable accountant, was about to crumble. Breaking point. Silverware chimed, an intrusive percussion in the sudden hush. 2 glasses of Merlot had oiled Paul's bravado. He leaned back, smugness plastered across his features. "Victor," he began, falsely affable, "retirement's a gamble, isn't it? Hope you've got the constitution for it. Wouldn't want to, you know." He waved a hand dismissively, concluding with a brittle laugh, "Outlive the nest egg." The words lingered, a bitter aftertaste in the air. Diane recoiled visibly, her gaze flitting nervously between us. I managed a smile, a pathetic, unfamiliar twitch. The gall of the man. To see me as some washed-up bean counter, clinging to a life half-lived. Perhaps, for too long, I'd allowed it. My chest constricted. Years of simmering resentment strained against the dam I'd built. It wasn't solely about finances, it was the condescension, the incessant, needling remarks that eroded my sense of self. Their looks, a blend of pity and barely disguised contempt. Heat surged, starting in my toes and climbing relentlessly. My hands, usually rock steady, trembled almost imperceptibly. The wine now tasted of iron. I glanced at Diane, her expression a mix of mortification and apprehension. Afraid of what Paul might unleash. Or what I might do. Something gave way inside. An image surfaced, my mother, her kind eyes and gentle spirit. She hadn't wanted me cowed by fear, to dim my own potential. She'd left me her legacy, not to bury it, but to embrace it, to build a meaningful life. And here I sat, letting this blustering fraud dictate my story. "Actually, Paul," I responded, my voice surprisingly even, belying the inner storm. "I'm quite comfortable, thank you." One eyebrow arched, a smirk twisting his lips. "Oh really, Victor? Did you finally hit the jackpot?" I inhaled deeply, oxygen flooding my lungs, bringing with it resolve. "Nothing like that, Paul. My mother established a trust for me. $8 million, to be exact." The smirk evaporated, replaced by gaping incredulity. Diane gasped, her hand flying to cover her mouth. The silence was absolute now, the gentle clinking replaced by the hammering of my own pulse. I watched as Paul's color drained, his carefully constructed pretense of dominance dissolving. His jaw worked silently, his eyes darting between us. The tormentor, tormented. The tide had turned. A watershed moment. The instant I emerged from the shadows into the sun. The instant I finally seized control. The revelation. The clatter of Paul's fork against his plate seemed deafening in the sudden silence. He'd been mid-sentence, pontificating about some savvy investment he'd made, when I dropped the bomb. The air in the overly decorated dining room, usually thick with Paul's self-importance, now felt brittle, charged with disbelief. I hadn't raised my voice. There was no dramatic flourish. I simply stated, "Actually, Paul, my retirement is more secure than you might imagine. My mother left me a trust fund. $8 million, to be precise." Diane choked on her wine. A crimson stain blossomed on her pristine white blouse. She dabbed at it with a napkin, her eyes wide and darting between Paul and me, like a trapped bird. Paul, for once, was speechless. His usual ruddy complexion paled slightly under the soft glow of the chandelier. His jaw worked soundlessly. I could almost see the calculations whirring behind his eyes, the gears of his opportunistic mind grinding to a halt. 8 million. Diane finally managed, her voice a strangled whisper. I nodded, taking a sip of water. The crystal glass felt cool and solid in my hand. Yes. After taxes, of course. Mother was frugal. But, all this time. Diane's gaze swept around the room, taking in the ostentatious decor, the impression of wealth Paul so carefully cultivated. It was all a facade, of course, built on credit and borrowed time. Compared to what I possessed, it was a child's playhouse next to a fortress. All this time, I confirmed. I explained, calmly, how my mother, a shrewd businesswoman despite her quiet demeanor, had built her fortune through a series of astute real estate investments. She'd established the trust specifically to shield it from the vagaries of the stock market and, perhaps, from fortune hunters. A subtle barb, aimed squarely at Paul. "Why didn't you ever say anything?" Diane demanded, her voice rising in pitch. A hint of betrayal laced her tone. I shrugged. It never seemed relevant. Besides, I added, looking directly at Paul, I prefer to keep my own counsel. Some things are best kept private. Paul found his voice, though it lacked its usual booming confidence. This is extraordinary, Victor. Truly. I had no idea. He attempted a jovial laugh, but it fell flat, echoing strangely in the strained atmosphere. You certainly kept that under wraps. Indeed. I picked up my fork, the weight of it grounding me. The roast chicken, previously unappetizing, now held a strange allure. I found that people treat you differently when they know you have money. I wanted to experience life without that particular filter. Diane was still staring, her eyes narrowed. And now? Why reveal it now? The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken accusations. Why now, after all these years of quiet acceptance, of playing the unassuming accountant? Why disrupt the carefully constructed narrative they had built around me? I met her gaze, my own unwavering. Because, Diane, sometimes it's necessary to remind people of your worth. Especially when they seem determined to diminish it. I turned to Paul, a faint smile playing on my lips. And because, Paul, I was tired of listening to you brag about your empire, built on less than solid foundations, shall we say. The chicken, surprisingly, was delicious. Cutting ties. It's structured as an irrevocable trust, I revealed, the last drops of wine circling in my glass. The delicate chime resonated loudly against the sudden quiet. My mother established it. I served as trustee, but access to the principal was forbidden until I reached 55. Even now, withdrawals are tethered to a yearly percentage, ensuring its longevity. Paul, moments ago radiating an air of untouchable superiority, now resembled a beached fish, his face flushed an alarming crimson. Diane, ever the strategist, recalibrated swiftly. Her gaze, sharp and calculating, bored into me. Why, Victor? Why the charade? All these years, the struggling artist act. I offered a shrug, a gesture of unexpected liberation. Perhaps I was indeed struggling. In a sense. I craved the experience of life unburdened. To measure my worth without a financial parachute. And let's be frank, I added, locking eyes with her, I needed to know if your affection was for me, or merely for what I could provide. The air thrummed with unspoken grievances and buried resentments. The leather of Paul's chair groaned in protest as he shifted, clearly ill at ease. He started to interject, but I silenced him with a wave. This concerns Diane and myself, Paul. Stay out of it. Turning back to my ex-wife, I continued, speaking of provisions, Diane, that segues nicely into my final point. A deep breath hitched in my chest. Years of bottled emotions threatened to suffocate me, but this time, instead of collapsing, I drew strength from them. As you are aware, my will has always included you. And I've occasionally extended a helping hand when you found yourself facing financial headwinds. Considered it a responsibility, of sorts. That ends here. The blood seemed to drain from Diane's face, leaving her ashen. What are you implying? I'm stating, unequivocally, that I am removing you from my will. And that any and all future financial assistance is hereby terminated. But why? Because of this newfound wealth? This is vindictive. Vindictive? A dry, humorless chuckle escaped my lips. No, Diane. This is realism. I'm simply done being taken for granted. Done being patronized. Done watching you and Paul flaunt your perceived superiority while secretly mocking my simple existence. I leaned forward, my voice a low, intense rumble. You based your life on faulty assumptions, Diane. Assumptions about me, my finances, my potential. And you were profoundly mistaken. I allowed you to cling to those illusions because it was less exhausting than constant correction. But those days are over. The silence that followed felt heavy, almost tangible. I could practically see the wheels spinning in Diane's brain as she desperately tried to assess the fallout. Paul, still struggling to digest the initial revelation, remained mute, his eyes flickering nervously between Diane and myself. You can't do this, Victor, Diane finally choked out, her voice betraying a tremor. We were married for 2 decades. I'm your family. Family? The word tasted like poison on my tongue. Family doesn't treat each other with such consistent disdain. Family doesn't belittle and dismiss. Family supports and respects. And you, Diane, have consistently failed on all counts. Rising to my feet, my movements deliberate and resolute, I stated, the trust is managed by a reputable firm. They will be contacting you, Paul, regarding the transfer of funds from our joint account. I expect it to be emptied and closed within the week. I paused, surveying them both, a strange brew of pity and satisfaction churning within me. Enjoy the remainder of your evening. And with those words, I turned and left, leaving them to grapple with the ruins of their preconceived notions. The cool air against my skin felt wonderfully bracing. For the first time in years, a sensation of unadulterated freedom washed over me. Suspicion arises. The restaurant's atmosphere, once saturated with Diane's practiced charm and Paul's demeaning pronouncements, now vibrated with Paul's palpable anxiety, a feverish hum replacing the prior droning. He cleared his throat, the rasp unusually loud in the sudden quiet. Victor, he began, his tone coated in such cloying sweetness it set my teeth on edge. That's quite a thing. I always suspected there was more to you than met the eye. I arched a brow, unconvinced. His abrupt shift was as obvious as a stagehand's hurried set change. The smugness had vanished, supplanted by an awkward attempt at bonhomie. He leaned forward now, eyes gleaming with something I couldn't quite name, though it reeked of avarice. More to me? I parried, sipping my wine. Let's just say my cards weren't all on the table. Diane sat petrified, her face a rigid sculpture of bewilderment and fury. She shot Paul a look sharp enough to cut glass, a silent accusation hanging between them like a drawn blade. He ignored her, fixated on me. Listen, Victor, he pressed, slapping me on the shoulder, an utterly unfamiliar and unwelcome gesture. We should connect. Hit the links, perhaps. Grab a drink. We clearly have much to discuss. I peeled his hand away with the caution one might employ disarming a bomb. I appreciate the thought, Paul, but my schedule's become rather demanding. Quite suddenly. His smile flickered, revealing the rapacious gleam beneath the surface veneer. Demanding with what, specifically? He pried, his voice too eager. Investments. Exotic locales. I consider myself something of an authority on both, more than happy to lend some insights. The man was beyond the pale. Arrogance was one thing when he believed he held all the aces, this groveling routine was simply pathetic. Something felt fundamentally off. As I watched him writhe, a memory surfaced, a throwaway line from Diane, months ago, during one of our stilted, obligatory phone calls. She'd been lamenting, predictably, about her struggling boutique, about skyrocketing overhead and plummeting sales. "Things are precarious, Victor," she'd said, her voice laced with a subtle, manipulative appeal for funds. "Paul's been assisting, but it's still a battle." I dismissed it then as another attempt to pry open my wallet. But now, witnessing Paul's desperate maneuverings, a chilling realization dawned. What if Diane hadn't been exaggerating? What if her business teetered on the brink? And what if Paul's assistance came with strings attached? The pieces clicked into place with a sickening finality. His hunger for specifics about my trust, his newfound interest in my finances, it wasn't mere greed. It was desperation. He wasn't after a mere taste of the pie, he was trying to shore up a failing venture. "Insights?" I responded, my tone glacial, my gaze unwavering. "I believe I'm perfectly capable of managing my own affairs, Paul. However, thank you for the gesture." I pushed back my chair and stood. "Diane, this has been illuminating. I trust you can navigate your own way home." I left them there, marinating in a toxic brew of resentment and suspicion. Stepping out into the crisp night air, the city lights blurred through a sheen of sudden perspiration. I'd revealed my hand, yes, but I had unwittingly exposed something far more malignant than I had imagined. Paul wasn't just being opportunistic. He was acting like a trapped animal. And I suspected Diane was about to discover she was sharing the trap. Unraveling the truth. The residue of Paul's insincere overtures still clung, a cloying presence I couldn't shake. I craved concrete evidence, not emotional quicksand. Dawn found me perched in a clinical office high above the city's frenetic pulse, recounting my history with Diane and Paul to Ms. Harding, a private investigator whose gaze could slice steel. "I need everything you can find on Paul Sterling," I stated, sliding across a surreptitiously obtained photo from Diane's birthday. "Every transaction, every shady dealing, every hidden vice." Ms. Harding accepted the image, her expression unreadable. "And what outcome are you hoping for, Mr. Cole?" "The truth, unvarnished and complete," I responded. That reckoning cost 2 weeks and a considerable sum. The P.I.S. report arrived like a lead weight, a chronicle detailing the gradual disintegration of Paul's carefully constructed image. Lavish getaways funded by questionable sources. A network of offshore companies nestled in the Caribbean. Most damningly, a blatant pattern of pilfering from Diane's struggling design studio. He'd been bleeding her dry, disguising it as consulting fees and unrecoverable expenses, all while subtly mocking my supposed financial ineptitude. The revelation hit me like a physical blow. Diane, despite her faults, didn't deserve such flagrant betrayal. I grappled with the implications, the burden of knowledge heavy on my shoulders. I couldn't stand idly by and watch Paul dismantle her life piece by piece. We met at a quaint cafe, a haven of mismatched furniture and the enticing aroma of freshly ground beans. "Victor, this is unexpected," Diane observed, a note of apprehension in her voice as she settled into the worn booth. Time had etched its passage on her face, the lines around her eyes were more pronounced, her smile less frequent. I inhaled deeply. "Diane, I have proof that Paul has been embezzling from your firm, and it is not good." Her complexion drained of color. "What? That's absurd. Why would you even suggest such a thing?" I slid a condensed version of the report across the table. "Ms. Harding leaves no stone unturned. Take a look at the dates, the amounts, the corporate shells." Her fingers trembled as she absorbed the information. A gasp escaped her lips, her eyes widening with disbelief and growing dread. The ambience of the café dissolved as she confronted the stark reality of Paul's duplicity. The confrontation between Diane and Paul that followed was, as I later learned, a maelstrom of accusations, shattered furniture, and unrestrained tears. He initially denied everything, but the evidence was insurmountable. Within days, the divorce proceedings commenced. Diane was reeling, not only from the financial deception but from the utter violation of her trust. The business was teetering on the edge of collapse, crippled by debt and Paul's mismanagement. I refused to let her lose everything. I extended a loan from my trust, sufficient to stabilize her finances and revitalize the business. It wasn't charity, I stressed. It was a strictly business arrangement, with fair terms and a clear path to repayment. She hesitated, her pride clashing with her desperation, but in the end, she accepted. I observed from a distance as Diane painstakingly rebuilt her life over the following months. She purged the incompetent staff Paul had installed, streamlined operations, and rediscovered her creative spark. Gradually, the business began to flourish, fueled by her renewed vigor and unwavering resolve. I never revealed my involvement with Ms. Harding or my initial investigation. I didn't want her to think I was gloating or seeking retribution. My sole aim was to help her salvage what remained. A year later, a handwritten note arrived from Diane. "The loan is fully repaid," it stated. "Thank you, Victor. For everything." There was no invitation to reconcile, no hint of a rekindled romance. Just simple gratitude. On my porch that evening, as the sunset painted the sky with strokes of fire and gold, I experienced a tranquility I hadn't felt in years. I had wielded my wealth not to dominate or impress, but to quietly redress an injustice. I had rewritten my story, not through vengeance, but through the offer of redemption. The $8 million hadn't just altered their perception of me, it had transformed my perception of myself. I was no longer the timid accountant, defined by his ex-wife and her patronizing husband. I was simply Victor Cole, a man who had finally found the strength to chart his own course. Thank you for spending your time with my story. Feel free to share your thoughts or reactions in the comments, I'd love to hear from you.